Hello everyone, welcome to our Grammar in Key Stage 2 webinar. My name is Dani Gardner. I am a class teacher in Year 2, phase leader for Years 2 and 3 and the literacy lead at the Bellum. I really hope that you find today's presentation helpful in supporting you to support your children from home. If at the end of the presentation you do have any questions, then there will be a Google form made available to you, so please don't hesitate to add any questions to that later on. So I just want to really briefly mention the term SPAG. You may well have heard of it already. SPAG simply stands for spelling, punctuation and grammar, and they make up the key areas in the teaching of English. There was a SPAG test introduced into the end of Key Stage 2, so for our Year 6 pupils to sit back in 2013, but that has been cancelled this academic year. So on this slide, you'll see a sort of almost a road map or a tube map inspired SPAG Mat. It's produced by SATS Companion, so you can find it online if you would like to. It's just a really nice, clear, colour-coded way of presenting everything within Key Stage 2 grammar that we want our children to know, that we will be teaching the children, and it's quite nice to use as a reference point if you want to go back and just double check something or remind yourself, remind the children of something in the future. This is where quite a lot of the information I'm going to go through in this presentation comes from as well, so that's quite a useful resource to have. So what will we cover today? I've tried to keep the presentation as concise as possible. Grammar is so huge, we could talk about it for hours and hours. So for today, we're just going to focus on kind of 4 subsections. I'm going to talk through grammar, sentences, conjunctions and clauses, verb forms and tenses. Anything else, so the other sections from the mat I just showed you, including vocabulary and spelling, standard English and punctuation, can be found on that mat or within the useful documents that we'll share with you at the end of the presentation. So for today, those are the 4 kind of main areas we're going to discuss. So before we launch into the very nitty-gritty parts of this presentation, I want to quickly talk about how we teach grammar at the Bellum. So first and foremost, we take a contextualised approach, which means all of our literacy learning is based on core texts, high quality texts, which means the children have a model straight away of how to use different grammatical structures and strategies within writing and how to communicate those effectively. We do also do some discrete teaching of grammar to allow for real kind of mastery of key skills, but we know that a combination of discrete teaching and a contextualised approach is going to be most effective for all of our pupils, knowing that a mixture of those two is going to help and support a wide variety of different types of learners. Repetition over time and year on year is really, really key, and from very early on down in the school all the way through to Year 6, we have a very consistent focus on sentence structure. So you're kind of repeating those very basic fundamental grammar strategies and building on those year on year. Also, very often our writing tasks that we set for the children will have a grammar specific focus in there somewhere so that the pupils can apply what they've learned within grammar lessons. We tend to sort of move away from writing tasks being solely focused on grammar, so that we're still encouraging the children to develop a real flow in their writing and a real pleasure for writing as well. But there will be grammar specific focus in there. the vast majority of the time. And then lastly, our learning environments, so the classrooms and the corridors and the kind of communal spaces in the building are there to reflect and reinforce the learning, and those are updated as the children learn new content and hopefully to remind them as they build on those skills. So what can you do at home? We would always encourage you to just read and read some more with the children. Reading really underpins everything the children do at primary school and all the way through to later life. So not only just reading with them, but actually discussing the language used is so important, and looking at how the language works within the sentence, you know, talking about things like why the author used that particular phrase, what effect does that language have on the reader, that sort of thing. So lots and lots of reading, lots of discussion around what they've read. We would also suggest just trying to focus on one element of the task at a time. So if it's a grammar task that's focusing on more than one strategy or key skill, pick one to focus on for a short amount of time and then move on to the next. Also just ensure that discrete grammar tasks are completed alongside the literacy lessons. I know that under our home learning scenario that we're in at the moment, teachers are setting a more general literacy task and then a more specific grammar task as well. So just making sure that the children are doing both of those. And then repetition, so just like we would do in school, repeating what they've learned as often as possible, as much as you can, to try and keep that fresh in their minds. And then finally, just trying to keep it light and as fun as possible. There are lots and lots of grammar games, suggestions online, and, you know, ideas for ways to keep it interesting. And there's actually a link here to a website called The School Run, where you'll find 13 ways to make grammar fun for children. Okay, so we're going to launch straight into some grammar now, and I'm going to talk about word forms to begin with, and then we'll move on to sentences. They are kind of very interchangeable, so do bear with me. Hopefully by the end it will all come together and all make a lot of sense. So let's talk about an object in a sentence first. So the object is who is the action done to or for within the sentence. The subject is the thing or person who is carrying out an action. The verb is a doing or action word, and the adverb gives additional information about the verb or the sentence. So I have an example down here. In the sentence, Andrea kindly spoke to George. Andrea is our subject because she's the person who is carrying out an action. Kindly is our adverb because it's telling us how she spoke to him. So kindly is giving us additional information about the verb. Spoke is the verb, that's the action or the doing word for what Andrea is doing in the sentence. And then George is the object because he's the person being spoken to in this case. Okay, moving on to nouns, pronouns and adjectives. So a noun can be a name, a person, a place or a thing. And there are 4 main types of nouns. So first of all, I'm going to talk about what common nouns are. So a common noun is a word that we use for something. So a boy, a cat, a bridge. And when we write those, we write them in lowercase. A proper noun is the name of something. So Peter is a proper noun, London Bridge, Queen Elizabeth, they're all proper nouns. And they would be capitalised because they are names. Then we have collective nouns. Collective nouns are words used to represent a group, and you might be talking about a group of animals, a group of people, or a group of things. So for example, team, crowd, choir, flock, and there are lots more. And then abstract nouns are those intangible things, so things that you can't touch or see. For example, a feeling or an emotion. So love is an abstract noun, anxiety, determination, freedom, and so on. So those are our nouns. Then we have pronouns. Pronouns would take the place of a noun in a sentence. And there are actually 9 types of pronouns, but we're just going to talk about 3 types today. We're going to talk about personal pronouns. So personal pronouns represent people or things. For example, I, you, he, she, it, we, you, they. Relative pronouns introduce a clause that describes a noun. So, for example, if we said the sentence, the man who stole your bike has been caught, the pronoun would be who. And there are some more examples like which, that, whom, whose. And then we have possessive pronouns as well. Possessive pronouns show possession and they replace the noun quite often in the sentence. For example, mine, yours, his, hers, ours, theirs. And then we have an adjective. An adjective is a word that describes a noun. So you can have all sorts of different adjectives. In the example down here, the sentence says, we met a friendly tiny dog. So in this sentence, we is the personal pronoun. It's representing who we're talking about in the sentence. We met a friendly tiny dog. So friendly and tiny are both adjectives. They're describing the noun, and the noun is dog. It's the thing in the sentence. Okay, moving on again. I'm just going to touch on phrases here, but we will return to phrases again later on in more detail. So I'm just going to talk about adverbial phrases. An adverbial phrase is a group of words without a verb that is built around an adverb. You might remember an adverb is a word that gives you additional information about the verb in the sentence. So some examples are as fast as possible, very slowly, all of a sudden. So in very slowly, the adverb is slowly and the adverbial phrase is very slowly. Determiners are words that introduce nouns. They can be specific or general. So you might have a computer, it's talking about a general computer, or the computer, it's talking about a specific one. And then prepositions. So prepositions sit before a noun to link it to a nearby word, and they normally explain where or when something is in relation to something else. And some examples here are after, above, on, during, in, by, behind. And just to give you a further example, in the sentence, she taught yoga on the beach, the preposition is on, and it sits before on the beach, and it links to taught. She taught yoga on the beach. Okay, so now we're moving on to think about sentences, and we're going to talk about the 3 main types of sentences that we use and that we teach the children to use. So we have simple, compound, and complex sentences. So first of all, a simple sentence is just that. It's nice and simple. It has one main clause. So in For example, Mrs. Jones is a great teacher. There's one clause there. In a compound sentence, there are two main clauses linked together with a coordinating conjunction or a semicolon, which you can see just there. And we'll talk about what coordinating conjunctions are very shortly. So, for example, Mrs. Jones is a great teacher because she cares is a compound sentence because there are two clauses linked with the coordinating conjunction because in this case. Then we have complex sentences. This can be a little bit of a sticking point for lots of children, so it's worth kind of going over this a few times, and we do revisit it at school a lot too. So in a complex sentence, there's a main clause, conjunction, and a subordinate clause. The main clause is kind of the most important part of the sentence, and if you took it out, it would be able to stand on its own and still make sense. But the subordinate clause is that sort of additional clause in the sentence, and if you took it out and stood it on its own, it wouldn't make sense on its own. So we can see an example here. Mrs. Jones is a great teacher as she smiles. Mrs. Jones is a great teacher is the main clause. If we took it out and had it stand on its own, it would make perfect sense. As she smiles is the subordinate clause, because if we took that out and stood it on its own, it wouldn't make sense without the context of the rest of the sentence. And we have the conjunction as in there too. So we have simple, compound and complex sentences. And then also within sentences, we have four more forms of sentence: statement, command, question, and exclamation. And these are Key Stage 2 children will be really familiar with. A statement simply tells the reader something. So for example, I like tea. A command is when you are telling someone to do something, and it usually starts with an imperative form of the verb. You might have heard of the children call them bossy verbs. That's a very Key Stage 1 term just to help them to get their heads around it. But they are called imperative verbs. So make is the imperative verb here. Make me a cup of tea is the command sentence. A question sentence uses a question mark to ask a question. So for example, how many cups of tea have you had? Ends with a question mark. This one starts with how. We know questions can start with what, when, could, should, do, etc. And then an exclamation sentence shows surprise. It often starts with what or how, and it usually contains a verb. And the only way in which this can become a little bit of a sticking point is because they normally start with what or how. Sometimes they can be confused with a question sentence. So it's just about looking at the order and the structure of the sentence really carefully. So for example, how thirsty I am, or what a magnificent sight that was. So we've got statements, commands, questions and exclamations. Okay, so we are moving on to conjunctions and clauses. This is the third subsection we're looking at today. So just to start off with, I just want to clarify that a phrase is not a clause. A phrase is a group of words which doesn't have a verb or a subject or both. So we're just going to look at three types of phrases now. A noun phrase is a phrase that starts with a noun. So London is the capital, for example. London is the noun there. London is the capital. An adjective phrase starts with an adjective. So remember, an adjective is a describing word. So for example, happy at his results. And lastly, a preposition phrase starts with a preposition. So remember, a preposition is a word that tells you where something is in relation to something else. So for example, under the weather. Under is the preposition there. So it's just 3 types of phrase: a noun phrase, an adjective phrase, and a preposition phrase. Great, so let's have a look at conjunctions in particular now. There are 2 different types of conjunctions that I'm going to talk about, but a conjunction is a word that's used to connect clauses or to connect words in the same clause. And you'll see at the bottom there are some sort of little word banks, some acronyms that we use with the children to help them to remember them, because there are so many to remember. So firstly, we have coordinating conjunctions, which include for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. And you can see that makes up fanboys, which is a nice way to try and remember them. In a sentence, for example, you might have he likes dogs and she likes cats, and is the coordinating conjunction there. And then we also have subordinating conjunctions, which include when, if, that, because, and some more, which you'll see again in the kind of child-friendly acronym at the bottom. In a sentence, for example, you might have I do not like dogs because they are loud, and because is your subordinating conjunction there. These are really handy as visual prompts, visual reminders to use with the children. Okay, so we're going to move on to talk about verb forms and tenses next. As we know, a verb is an action word or a doing word, and we know that there are 3 main tenses, those being the past, the present, and the future. We're going to start off by talking about the simple present, the simple past, the present perfect, and the past perfect. So to begin with, the simple present is something which happens regularly, and the verb in a sentence that's written in the simple present will be the base form of that verb, so the verb that you would find in the dictionary. For example, I walk to school. The verb walk is the base form of the verb to walk, which we would find in the dictionary. The simple past would be something that's finished. So for example, I walked to school this morning, or I drank my water. If we're talking about a regular verb, so the base form of the verb in the simple past, we would add the suffix ed, like in walked. And then if we're using an irregular verb and we're changing it to the past tense, then that can look different from one verb to another. It can be formed in a range of ways. So drank is just one example of the base form verb drink in the simple past. Then we have the present perfect. Now the present perfect uses have or has. There are 2 examples here. I have read The 3 Little Pigs, or I have played for this team before. Now, the present perfect is just another aspect of present tense. So it's used for a completed activity that began in the past, and often or sometimes the activity continues into the present. So that can be a little bit confusing, but the main thing to remember is it's a form of the present tense, but it has begun in the past. I have read The 3 Little Pigs. I have played for this team before. Then we have the past perfect, and this uses had. So for example, he had left the room. Sarah had completed her book before I spoke to her. So here we've got had left and had completed. So you've got had before your past tense verb. And again, the past perfect tense describes a completed activity in the past. So carrying on thinking about the past and present tense, we're going to think about the progressive form now. So we're going to look at the present progressive and the past progressive. So in the present progressive, there is an ongoing activity in the present or a scheduled activity in the future. So I've got two examples here. She is reading the book describes an ongoing activity in the present, and then I am working at home this week describes a scheduled activity in the future. Then we have the past progressive, which is an ongoing activity again, but in the past, and it quite often sets the scene for another activity that's almost up and coming. So for example, he was reading the book when I arrived, sort of sets the scene for what's going to happen when I arrived at his home or at his house. Then we have the subjunctive form, and there are all sorts of examples of the subjunctive form, but it's normally hypothetical and expresses a wish or a demand or a suggestion. So for example, I wouldn't do that if I were you is making a suggestion, or I wish it were real is expressing a wish. And there are lots more examples of the subjunctive form. And finally, we're just going to look at some types of verbs to finish with. We've got three more types to look at, which are modal verbs, active verbs, and passive verbs. So first of all, modal verbs are verbs used to show the level of possibility, to indicate ability, show obligation, or to give permission. So for example, we have will, may, must. In a sentence, it might sound like this. We will have a sandwich for lunch. You could also say we must have a sandwich for lunch, for example. Then we have active verbs. So active verbs are verbs where the subject in the sentence does the action, which means that it will be an active sentence. So here's an example. In John washed the dishes, John is the subject. He's the personal object doing the action, doing the verb. So washed is an active verb in this case. On the kind of flip side of that, we have passive verbs. And passive verbs are where the subject of the sentence has the action done to it. So again, you'd find that in a passive sentence. For example, in the dishes were washed by John, the dishes are actually now the subject of the sentence, but they are receiving the action instead rather than doing it. So we have reached the end now. I do hope that that wasn't too overwhelming and that everything was ringing some bells and sounded familiar or sort of familiar to you. I know that for me and for lots of teachers I know, having a resource a bit like this presentation up our sleeves to refer to when we need it as a bit of a revision tool can be really, really helpful, because trying to remember everything is almost an impossible task. So I do hope that you find this useful too. On this slide, there are 3 links to some other useful documents that I would recommend taking a look at if you think that you would like a little bit of further support. So the first one is a glossary of grammar terms, which is a government produced document, and it has every term on there that the children will be coming across. So that's really useful. The second one, the Primary Grammar Glossary for Parents, is actually produced by the same website that I mentioned earlier on called The School Run, and it's essentially the same information as in that first document, the glossary of grammar terms, but it's just presented a bit differently, and it's laid out really nice and clearly. You might find, depending on what works best for you, you might find that one's a little bit more pleasant to digest and read. And lastly, there is a link to the English appendix with vocabulary, grammar and punctuation included. And that one can be really useful because it's specified by year group. So you can head straight to whichever year group your child is in and have a look there as well. Lastly, here are just two book recommendations. The first one is the Oxford Spelling, Punctuation and Grammar Dictionary. If you can get your hands on one of those, they are really useful for the children to have just next to them when they're working away on any grammar specific tasks, to have as a kind of additional reference point. They're really clear and really child friendly. And lastly is a book called Grammar for Teachers by John Seeley, which is recommended by Nancy Wayman. I know she really loves this one. There are a few out there, but I think this one is, from what I have heard, nice and easy to pick up and digest. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope the rest of the grammar learning from home goes very well.